In 1871, a German geologist named Karl Mauck stood at the edge of a forest in southern Africa and saw something that made his hands shake. Towering walls of stone rose out of the bush, walls built without a single drop of mortar, stacked so precisely that not even a knife blade could slide between the blocks. Some were over 30 feet high, some curved in ways that seemed almost impossible for the tools available at the time, and they stretched across nearly 1,800 acres of land. Mauck didn't believe what he was looking at, not because the ruins weren't real. They were unmistakably, massively real, but because of who he assumed couldn't have built them. He would spend the rest of his life trying to convince the world that this was the lost city of the Queen of Sheba, that it was Phoenician, that it was anything other than the work of African hands. He was wrong. And the century-long cover-up that followed his mistake is one of the strangest, most revealing detective stories in the history of archaeology. This is the story of Great Zimbabwe, a city so advanced, so massive, and so mysterious that the people who found it built an entire mythology to avoid admitting who made it. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand not just how it was built, but why the greatest scientific minds of the 19th and early 20th centuries chose to lie about it, and what secret buried beneath the hill complex finally forced them to stop. Stick around, because later in this video, I'm going to show you the one piece of evidence that even the most stubborn colonial archaeologists couldn't explain away. A find so specific, so undeniable, that it cracked the entire false narrative wide open. But to understand why that discovery mattered so much, we need to start at the beginning, with a city that, at its peak, may have rivaled London in population. Let's set the scene properly, because most people, even people who consider themselves well-read on world history, have never heard of Great Zimbabwe. That absence is not an accident. It's a symptom of the very mystery we're investigating. Great Zimbabwe sits in the modern-day nation of Zimbabwe, a country that, in fact, took its name from this very site. Zimbabwe derives from the Shona phrase Dzimba dza Mabwe, meaning houses of stone, or in another translation, Dzimba Woye, venerated houses. The people who live in this region today are the direct descendants, culturally, linguistically, and by DNA, of the people who built this city. At its height, somewhere between the 11th and 15th centuries, Great Zimbabwe was the center of a vast kingdom. Estimates on population vary, but many researchers place the number of inhabitants at its peak somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centers in sub-Saharan Africa at the time, and comparable in scale to contemporary European cities. The site itself is divided into three major sections: the hill complex, believed to be the royal or spiritual center; the great enclosure, the most iconic and massive structure at the site; and the valley complex, a sprawling residential area where the majority of the population likely lived. The Great Enclosure alone is the largest single ancient structure in Africa south of the Sahara. Its outer wall stretches over 250 meters in circumference, rises as high as 11 meters, that's roughly the height of a 3-story building, and required an estimated 1 million individual granite blocks. And here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. Not one of those blocks is held together with mortar, cement, or any binding agent whatsoever. They are dry stacked, fitted, balanced against each other with such mathematical precision that the walls have survived, largely intact, for somewhere between 600 and 900 years, through rain seasons, earth tremors, and centuries of neglect. How is that possible? That question alone has driven engineers, archaeologists, and stonemasons to obsession for over a century. And we're going to dig into the actual construction techniques in detail in just a few minutes. including a specific quarrying trick the builders used that modern engineers only fully understood in the last few decades. But first, we need to talk about what happened when European explorers found this place, because the story of how Great Zimbabwe was discovered by the West is, in many ways, just as important and just as damning as the story of how it was built. Karl Mauk was not the first outsider to hear about Great Zimbabwe. Portuguese traders had recorded rumors of a great stone fortress in the interior as early as the 16th century, associating it vaguely with legendary lost cities of gold. But Mauk was the first European to actually document the ruins in detail, arriving in September 1871. What Mauk found should have been, by any objective standard, a moment of pure scientific triumph. Instead, it triggered one of the most sustained episodes of racially motivated historical denial in the modern era. Mosh looked at the towering walls, the geometric precision of the great enclosure, the sheer scale of the undertaking, and instead of asking, which African civilization built this, he asked, which non-African civilization could have built this? He didn't ask that question because the evidence pointed him there. He asked it because his worldview, steeped in 19th century European racial theory, made it almost unthinkable that black Africans could have engineered something of this magnitude. In his writings, Mauk speculated that the ruins might be connected to the Queen of Sheba, or that a piece of wood he found at the site must be cedar, sacred wood used by King Solomon, even though it was later identified as a local African hardwood. This wasn't a fringe theory that died with Mauk. It became the dominant explanation for Great Zimbabwe for the next 60 years, promoted by explorers, journalists, and even some archaeologists who should have known better. Cecil Rhodes, the British colonialist whose name would later be given to the colony of Rhodesia and whose company controlled the territory where the ruins sat, actively funded and promoted the idea that Great Zimbabwe was built by ancient Phoenicians, Arabs, or a lost white race. Rhodes commissioned excavations specifically designed to find evidence supporting this theory, and the excavators he hired, men like J. Theodore Bent, dug through the site with almost no scientific rigor, tearing apart archaeological layers in a desperate hunt for anything that looked foreign. Why did this matter so much to men like Rhodes? Because the implications were explosive. If Great Zimbabwe was built by ancient Africans, it meant that African societies were capable of complex engineering, long-distance trade, centralized political power, and monumental architecture, directly undermining the entire ideological justification for colonization, which rested on the claim that African peoples were incapable of civilization without European guidance. In other words, admitting the truth about Great Zimbabwe would have been a direct threat to the colonial project itself. So for decades, the lie was maintained, not through subtlety, but through active suppression. And here's where the story gets even darker, because there's one piece of this cover-up that most documentaries never mention: the way colonial authorities in Rhodesia treated archaeologists who dared to tell the truth. I'll show you exactly what happened to the woman who first proved, scientifically, that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, and the punishment she faced for being right, in just a few minutes. It's one of the most infuriating stories in the entire history of archaeology, and almost nobody knows it happened. But first, let's talk about the actual evidence. The artifacts, the carbon dating, the architectural comparisons that eventually made the truth impossible to deny. By the early 20th century, cracks were beginning to show in the lost white civilization theory, mostly because actual scientists, using actual methods, kept finding evidence that contradicted it at every turn. In 1905, British Egyptologist David Randall McIver conducted the first systematic archaeological excavation of Great Zimbabwe using rigorous stratigraphic methods, meaning he carefully studied the layers of soil and artifacts to understand the chronological sequence of the site. His conclusion was blunt and, for the time, radical. The ruins were of African origin, built relatively recently, within the medieval period, and showed no credible evidence of any non-African civilization's involvement. This should have settled the matter. It didn't. Randall McIver's findings were dismissed, attacked, and largely ignored by the colonial establishment, which continued to promote the Phoenician and Sheba theories in tourist literature, school textbooks, and official government publications well into the 20th century. Then, in 1929, a British archaeologist named Gertrude Caton Thompson led a far more extensive excavation, again using careful stratigraphic analysis. She examined the pottery, the daga, a type of clay building material used in the site's residential structures, and the layout of the ruins, comparing them directly to known African architectural and cultural traditions elsewhere in the region. Her conclusion was unequivocal. Great Zimbabwe was, in her words, a native building, an entirely African achievement, built by the ancestors of the Shona people, with no evidence whatsoever of foreign construction or influence. Caton Thompson didn't just state an opinion, she backed it up with specifics that were hard to argue against. The pottery found at the site matched local Shona ceramic traditions. The architectural style, dry stone walling using coursed granite blocks, matched other, smaller stone-walled sites scattered across the region, all clearly part of the same building tradition. And crucially, she found no artifacts of Phoenician, Arab, or any other foreign origin embedded in the foundational layers of the structure, only trade goods, like Persian and Chinese ceramics, that arrived later, through contact and commerce, not through construction or settlement. Here's a detail that should genuinely disturb you. For stating these obvious, evidence-backed conclusions, Caton Thompson was mocked, professionally ostracized, and accused by segments of the Rhodesian settler press of being naive, gullible, or even of having an agenda. A woman who did the actual scientific work was treated as less credible than men who had invented myths out of thin air to serve a political ideology. It would take modern radiocarbon dating, developed decades later, to fully confirm what Caton Thompson and Randall McIver had already shown. Carbon dating of organic material at the site places the major construction phases of Great Zimbabwe between approximately 1100 and 1450 CE, squarely within the time frame of the Shona-related kingdom of Zimbabwe's rise to power, with zero credible evidence of external construction influence. And yet, even after all of this, the Rhodesian government, right up until the collapse of white minority rule in 1980, continued to censor museum displays, arrest or intimidate researchers who publicly stated Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, and promote the false foreign builders narrative in official state publications. Let that sink in. This wasn't an outdated 19th century myth that quietly faded away as science advanced. It was an actively enforced, government-sanctioned lie that persisted for over 100 years, through 2 full archaeological refutations, because the truth was too politically dangerous to admit. Now, with the who and the why established, it's time to get into the part of this story I know a lot of you have been waiting for, the actual mechanics of construction. Because once you strip away the mythology, what's left is one of the most sophisticated pieces of pre-industrial engineering anywhere in the world, and the techniques the builders used are honestly kind of mind-blowing once you understand them. Here's something most documentaries about Great Zimbabwe get completely wrong. They treat the dry stone construction as some kind of unexplainable ancient mystery, as if the builders had access to lost technology. They didn't need lost technology. What they had was something arguably more impressive, an intimate, generations-deep understanding of the specific geology beneath their feet. The granite in the region around Great Zimbabwe has a particular natural property that the builders exploited with extraordinary precision. This granite naturally fractures into flat, layered sheets when exposed to alternating heat and cold, a process geologists call exfoliation. The builders figured out that if they lit fires against exposed granite outcrops and then rapidly cooled the rock with water, the stone would crack along natural fault lines into smooth, flat slabs. This is the secret I promised you earlier, the quarrying trick that took modern engineers decades to fully appreciate. It wasn't brute force chiseling, it was controlled thermal fracturing, using nothing but fire, water, and an intimate knowledge of how the local stone behaved. The builders weren't fighting the material, they were reading it. Once quarried, these granite slabs were shaped using stone hammers and worked into roughly rectangular blocks, not perfectly uniform, but consistent enough that they could be stacked in tight, interlocking courses. Because granite naturally has a slight grain and consistent thickness when split this way, the blocks could be laid without mortar and still achieve remarkable structural stability. The weight of each successive layer presses down and inward, locking the layers below into place, similar in principle to how a dry stone wall in the English countryside stays standing, but scaled up to a size and precision that dwarfs anything in medieval Europe. Look closely at the great enclosure's outer wall, and you'll notice something else remarkable. A decorative chevron pattern running along the upper courses, created by alternating the orientation of individual stones. This wasn't structurally necessary. It was aesthetic, a deliberate design choice, requiring planning, artistic vision, and precise execution across a wall hundreds of meters long. Whoever built this wasn't just solving an engineering problem, they were making a statement. And that statement gets even more intense when you consider the conical tower, a solid, mortarless stone structure inside the great enclosure, roughly 10 meters tall and 5 meters in diameter at its base, built entirely without any known functional purpose. No doorway, no interior chamber, no clear practical use has ever been identified. Most researchers now believe it was purely symbolic, possibly representing a traditional grain bin, a symbol of wealth, abundance, and the king's ability to provide for his people. Others suggest it may have carried religious or ceremonial significance tied to fertility and royal authority. Think about the confidence required to build a massive, purely symbolic structure, using over 15,000 carefully shaped stone blocks, requiring immense labor and resources for a monument that does nothing except exist as a statement of power. That's not the work of a struggling, disorganized society. That's the work of a kingdom so wealthy, so stable, and so secure in its resources that it could afford to build monuments purely to project strength. Which brings us to a question we haven't answered yet. Where did all that wealth actually come from? Because here's the thing, Great Zimbabwe wasn't just an isolated stone city sitting alone in the African interior. It was the beating heart of a trade network that stretched, almost unbelievably, all the way to China. I'll show you exactly how that worked in a moment, including the specific imported artifact found at the site that proves Great Zimbabwe was trading directly or indirectly with merchants thousands of miles away. But to understand why that discovery matters, we first need to talk about gold. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe, the political entity centered on this city, controlled access to some of the richest gold-bearing regions in southern Africa. The Zimbabwean Plateau sits atop what geologists call the Great Dyke, a massive mineral-rich geological formation containing significant deposits of gold, along with copper, iron, and tin. Archaeological surveys have identified literally thousands of ancient gold mining sites scattered across Zimbabwe and neighboring regions. Shallow shafts, surface workings, and processing sites where gold ore was crushed and smelted using furnaces capable of reaching the temperatures necessary for extraction. This wasn't small-scale, opportunistic digging. It was organized, large-scale resource extraction sustained over centuries. That gold didn't stay local. Great Zimbabwe sat at the center of a trade corridor connecting the interior of southern Africa to the Indian Ocean coast, specifically to Swahili coastal trading cities like Kilwa, Sofala, and Mozambique Island. Gold, along with ivory and other goods, flowed from Great Zimbabwe eastward to these coastal ports, where Swahili and Arab traders exchanged them for imported goods arriving via the Indian Ocean Trade Network, one of the largest and most sophisticated maritime trade systems in the pre-modern world. And this is where the evidence becomes almost too specific to argue with. Excavations at Great Zimbabwe have recovered imported artifacts, including Persian glazed pottery, Chinese Celadon ceramics dating to the Ming Dynasty, glass beads from the Middle East and South Asia, and even a small number of Arab coins. One particularly striking find, a Chinese ceramic dish, provides direct physical evidence that goods from Great Zimbabwe's trade network reached, at minimum, ports actively trading with Ming China, one of the most powerful and wealthy empires on Earth at the time. Let that settle for a second. While European explorers, centuries later, were insisting this could not possibly be the work of Africans, the actual people living at Great Zimbabwe were sitting on imported ceramics from a Chinese dynasty most of those same explorers would have recognized by name. The city wasn't isolated. It wasn't primitive. It was a fully connected node in a global trade system that stretched from the interior of Africa to the ports of East Asia. This is also where we get one of the most compelling explanations for why Great Zimbabwe was eventually abandoned, a mystery that's almost as compelling as its construction. And that mystery is exactly where we're headed next, right after we look at one more curious detail archaeologists uncovered at the site: strange carved soapstone birds that may hold the key to understanding the entire spiritual worldview of the people who built this place. Among the most iconic artifacts recovered from Great Zimbabwe are 8 carved soapstone birds, discovered primarily at the hill complex, the site's spiritual and possibly royal core. Each bird stands roughly 30 to 40 centimeters tall, perched atop tall stone monoliths, and each one displays subtle stylistic differences, suggesting they may represent specific ancestors, rulers, or spiritual entities rather than a single generic symbol. These birds are so culturally significant that one of them appears on the modern national flag of Zimbabwe, a direct, deliberate act of reclamation. After independence in 1980, the newly formed nation didn't just rename itself after the ruins. It placed the Great Zimbabwe bird at the center of its national identity, a symbolic rejection of the century of colonial denial that had preceded it. Scholars still debate the exact meaning of the birds. Some researchers connect them to the bateleur eagle, a bird deeply significant in Shona spiritual tradition, believed to serve as a messenger between the human world and the realm of ancestral spirits. Others suggest the birds may represent specific historical kings, functioning almost like carved royal portraits or dynastic markers, marking a lineage of rulers who once governed from the hill complex. What's not in dispute is the level of skill required to carve them. Soapstone is softer than granite, but working it into detailed, symmetrical figures, especially figures meant to convey specific religious or political meaning, requires trained artisans, established artistic traditions, and time. This wasn't incidental decoration. It was intentional, sophisticated symbolic art, produced by a society with a mature, established belief system and stable enough conditions to support dedicated craftspeople who didn't need to spend all their time farming or fighting. And here's a small detail that rarely gets mentioned, but which I find genuinely fascinating. When colonial-era looters and collectors removed several of these birds from the site in the late 19th century, some ending up in South Africa, in the private collection of none other than Cecil Rhodes himself, it took until 1981, a full year after Zimbabwean independence, for the last of the stolen birds to finally be returned. One remained in South Africa until then, a physical, literal example of colonial extraction, extending even to the sacred symbols of the very civilization being denied. So now, we've covered who built Great Zimbabwe, how they built it, how they funded it, and what they believed. That leaves one final, haunting question, the one that might be the most mysterious of all. Why did they leave? By around 1450 CE, after roughly 3 centuries as the political, economic, and spiritual capital of a powerful kingdom, Great Zimbabwe began to decline. Within a relatively short period, the city was largely abandoned, and the center of political power in the region shifted elsewhere, eventually giving rise to successor states, like the Kingdom of Mutapa to the north. For decades, this abandonment was treated as its own mini-mystery, and several competing theories have been proposed, each with real archaeological and environmental evidence behind it. The most widely supported theory centers on environmental strain. A city supporting somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, concentrated in one location for centuries, would have placed enormous pressure on the surrounding land. Deforestation for fuel and construction, soil depletion from intensive agriculture, and overgrazing by cattle herds could have gradually degraded the immediate environment to the point where it could no longer sustainably support the population. Some researchers have pointed to environmental and climatic shifts during this period, including possible changes in regional rainfall patterns, as a contributing factor that placed additional strain on agricultural output. A second theory focuses on the depletion of accessible gold resources. As the shallow, easily worked gold deposits near Great Zimbabwe became exhausted, the economic incentive to maintain the city as the central hub of the gold trade would have diminished, encouraging a gradual shift of political and economic power toward regions with fresher access to gold and better positioning along evolving trade routes, particularly further north, closer to the Zambezi River and increasingly important trade connections. A third theory suggests political fragmentation, that the kingdom simply grew too large and complex to be effectively governed from a single center, leading elite factions to break away and establish their own competing centers of power, gradually siphoning population, resources, and prestige away from Great Zimbabwe. The truth is probably a combination of all 3 factors, compounding on each other over time. Environmental stress reducing agricultural capacity, economic shifts undermining the city's centrality to trade, and political fragmentation accelerating a decline that was already underway. What's crucial to understand is that this wasn't a collapse in the dramatic, catastrophic sense. No invasion, no single triggering disaster that the archaeological record has identified. It was a gradual eclipse, a slow transfer of power and population to new centers, leaving behind the empty shell of the greatest city in the region's history, a shell that would sit largely undisturbed for roughly 4 centuries, until Karl Mauck stumbled into it in 1871 and immediately, tragically, got the story wrong. Here's what makes the story of Great Zimbabwe so much bigger than just an archaeological curiosity. It's a case study in how historical narratives get shaped, not by evidence, but by the assumptions and interests of whoever holds the power to write the story down. For over a century, the dominant narrative about this site had nothing to do with what the stones, the pottery, the trade goods, or the carbon dating actually showed. It had everything to do with what a colonial government needed to believe, and needed the rest of the world to believe, in order to justify its own existence. And the corrective process wasn't quick or easy. It took 2 separate, rigorous scientific excavations, decades apart, both reaching the same conclusion. And even then, it took the complete political transformation of an entire country, the end of Rhodesia and the birth of independent Zimbabwe in 1980, before the official narrative could finally, fully change. Today, Great Zimbabwe is recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, standing as both a monument to an extraordinary African civilization and, in a way, a monument to how long a well-funded lie can survive when it serves the interests of the powerful. The people who built these walls, ancestors of the Shona people who still live in the region today, created something that, structurally, spiritually, and economically, ranks among the great achievements of the medieval world. And for a century, that achievement was buried under a mythology invented specifically to deny it ever happened. That's the real mystery of Great Zimbabwe. Not how the stones were stacked, we've answered that. Not where the gold went, or why the city was abandoned, we've covered that too. The real mystery is how a truth this solid, this physically undeniable, standing 11 meters tall out of solid granite, could be denied for so long by people who had absolutely no evidence to support their alternative story, just the need for that story to be true. Here's something that almost never makes it into mainstream documentaries about Great Zimbabwe, and it's a detail that completely changes how you should think about this site. Great Zimbabwe wasn't a one-off architectural miracle. It was the largest and most elaborate expression of a building tradition that spanned an enormous geographic area, with over 200 similar dry stone ruins identified across present-day Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Botswana, and South Africa. This matters enormously for the investigation we're conducting, because it directly undermines the old, lost foreign civilization theory in a way that's almost mathematically obvious once you see it laid out. If Great Zimbabwe were built by a single wandering group of Phoenicians, Arabs, or some mythical, lost white race, you would expect one structure, maybe a small cluster, not an entire regional architectural tradition, refined and repeated across dozens of sites, over centuries, by people who were clearly building according to a shared cultural blueprint. Take Khami, located roughly 22 kilometers west of modern Bulawayo. Khami rose to prominence after Great Zimbabwe's decline, likely serving as a capital for the Torwa dynasty, starting around the late 15th century. Its architecture shows clear stylistic continuity with Great Zimbabwe, the same dry stone technique, the same decorative patterning along wall courses, but also distinct regional innovations, including elaborate stepped platforms and retaining walls built into natural granite hillsides, suggesting the building tradition wasn't static. It was evolving, adapting, being refined by successive generations of builders who inherited and expanded on the techniques pioneered at Great Zimbabwe. Then there's Nalatale, a smaller but strikingly decorative site featuring some of the most elaborate chevron, herringbone, and cord patterning found anywhere in the region. Stonework so intricate that early European visitors to the site, even those still clinging to foreign origin theories, were forced to admit it represented a level of decorative sophistication rarely seen in dry stone construction anywhere in the world. And perhaps most tellingly, there's Manyikeni, located far to the east in modern Mozambique, near the Indian Ocean coast. Manyikeni is smaller than Great Zimbabwe, but it shares the same fundamental construction techniques and appears to have functioned as a trade outpost, a physical link in the chain connecting the interior gold-producing regions to the Swahili coastal trading network we discussed earlier. Its existence provides direct physical confirmation of the trade relationship between Great Zimbabwe's kingdom and the Indian Ocean world. Put these sites together, and a completely different picture emerges. Not a single mysterious structure built by outsiders and then abandoned, but a widespread, sophisticated, multi-generational African architectural tradition, practiced across an enormous territory, evolving over centuries, in direct response to shifting trade routes, political fortunes, and available resources. This is, honestly, one of the most damning pieces of evidence against the colonial mythology, and one that gets far too little attention. It's not just that Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, It's that Great Zimbabwe was the crown jewel of an entire civilizational tradition of African stone architecture, one that colonial narratives tried to erase almost entirely from public memory, leaving Great Zimbabwe looking like an isolated anomaly instead of what it actually was, the peak achievement of a sophisticated, widespread, and enduring engineering culture. And that raises an important question we haven't fully answered yet. What do we actually know about the people themselves? Not just their stones, but their voices. Because it turns out, there's an entire body of oral history passed down through generations that colonial archaeologists almost completely ignored. And it might be the most direct evidence of all. One of the most frustrating aspects of the entire Great Zimbabwe controversy is how long it took European researchers to seriously engage with Shona oral traditions. The generations-deep, carefully preserved historical accounts passed down within local communities, describing the founding, rulers, and eventual decline of the kingdom centered at Great Zimbabwe. For decades, colonial-era scholars dismissed oral history as unreliable folklore, unworthy of serious academic consideration compared to written records or physical artifacts. This dismissal wasn't neutral or scientific. It was itself a product of the same racial hierarchy that fueled the lost foreign civilization myth. Written European sources were treated as inherently trustworthy. African oral traditions, preserved with careful formal structures and passed down through specifically trained lineage keepers, were treated as unreliable myth. But as anthropologists and historians began taking Shona oral traditions seriously in the mid to late 20th century, a remarkably consistent picture began to emerge, one that lines up closely with the archaeological evidence. Shona oral traditions describe Great Zimbabwe as the capital of a powerful kingdom ruled by a dynasty whose leaders held the title Mwene Mutapa, or, in some traditions, an earlier related title tied specifically to the Zimbabwe dynasty before the later Mutapa state emerged further north. These traditions describe a highly centralized political structure, with the king serving simultaneously as political ruler and central religious figure, responsible for maintaining the spiritual well-being of the kingdom through ritual and connection to ancestral spirits, which lines up precisely with the religious significance archaeologists now attribute to structures like the hill complex and the soapstone birds we discussed earlier. Oral traditions also consistently describe the kingdom's wealth as being tied directly to control over gold and cattle, two resources that align exactly with the archaeological evidence of extensive gold mining operations and large livestock enclosures found throughout the site and surrounding region. Cattle, in particular, held enormous cultural and economic significance, functioning as a store of wealth, a marker of social status, and a central element of political alliance building through practices like cattle loaning between rulers and subordinate chiefs, a system that would have helped bind together the wider kingdom beyond the walls of Great Zimbabwe itself. Perhaps most significantly, oral traditions describing the eventual decline and abandonment of Great Zimbabwe consistently point to some combination of resource depletion, particularly references to overworked land and diminishing water sources, and political succession disputes among ruling elites, which lines up almost exactly with the environmental and political fragmentation theories that archaeologists later arrived at independently through physical evidence. This convergence is genuinely remarkable when you sit with it. Two completely separate methods of historical investigation, Western archaeological science on one hand, and generations-old Shona oral tradition on the other, arrived at strikingly similar conclusions about the kingdom's rise, its economic foundations, its religious structure, and its eventual decline. And yet, for the better part of a century, only one of these two sources was treated as credible by the academic and political establishment. This is a pattern worth sitting with, because it's not unique to Great Zimbabwe. Time and time again throughout the history of archaeology, indigenous oral traditions turn out to preserve genuinely accurate historical information. Information that gets dismissed for decades simply because it wasn't written down in a European language, in a European format, by a European hand. Now, with the full historical, architectural, economic, and oral historical picture in place, it's time to talk about what happened to the kingdom's political legacy after Great Zimbabwe's decline. Because the story doesn't end with abandonment, it evolves. And it leads directly into one of the most powerful and wealthy African kingdoms most people have never heard of, the Kingdom of Mutapa. When Great Zimbabwe's political and economic centrality began to fade around the mid-15th century, the kingdom's power didn't simply vanish, it relocated and transformed. According to both oral tradition and archaeological evidence, a ruler traditionally identified as Nyatsimba Mutota led a migration northward toward the Zambezi River Valley in search of fresh salt and gold resources as the older sources near Great Zimbabwe became depleted or increasingly contested. This migration led to the founding of what would become the Kingdom of Mutapa, sometimes called Mwene Mutapa or Monomotapa in historical European sources, which rose to become one of the most powerful and wealthiest states in southern African history, controlling trade routes stretching from the interior goldfields all the way to Portuguese and Swahili trading posts on the Indian Ocean coast. The Mutapa state inherited much of Great Zimbabwe's political structure, religious traditions, and economic model, centralized royal authority, control over gold production and trade, and a similar reliance on cattle wealth and tribute systems from subordinate chiefdoms. And crucially, the Mutapa Kingdom is one of the earliest African political entities to appear extensively in written European records, thanks to direct contact with Portuguese traders and missionaries beginning in the early 16th century. This is actually a critical piece of evidence in our broader investigation, because Portuguese written accounts from this period, separate entirely from Shona oral tradition or later archaeological work, describe the Mutapa kings as ruling over sophisticated, wealthy, highly organized African states with structured governance, established legal systems, extensive gold production, and formal diplomatic relationships with foreign powers. In other words, we have three completely independent lines of evidence: archaeological excavation, indigenous oral tradition, and contemporary written accounts from European visitors who had direct, first-hand contact with the successor kingdom, all converging on the same basic picture: sophisticated, centralized, wealthy African states, directly descended culturally and politically from the civilization that built Great Zimbabwe. Given that mountain of converging evidence, it becomes almost impossible to take the old Karl Mauk-era mythology seriously anymore. And yet, as we discussed earlier, that mythology persisted in Rhodesian state propaganda, literally until the year of the country's independence, in 1980. Understanding just how long that gap remained between overwhelming scientific consensus and official political acknowledgement is maybe the most important takeaway from this entire investigation. Because it tells us something uncomfortable: historical truth, even when it's backed by mountains of physical, oral, and written evidence, doesn't automatically win. It only wins when the people in power find it convenient, tolerable, or unavoidable to admit. Even today, Great Zimbabwe hasn't given up all its secrets. Ongoing archaeological and conservation work at the site continues to reveal new details about daily life, trade, and construction techniques that continue to refine our understanding of the kingdom. Recent conservation efforts have focused heavily on structural preservation, since even mortarless dry stone walls that have survived for centuries remain vulnerable to erosion, plant root damage, and the effects of increased tourist foot traffic. Engineers and conservationists working at the site today study the original construction techniques, not just out of historical curiosity, but out of practical necessity, understanding exactly how these walls were originally built and stabilized in order to properly conserve them for future generations without damaging their structural integrity or historical authenticity. Researchers have also continued to study the extensive daga structures, the clay and gravel building material used for residential huts throughout the valley complex, which provide crucial evidence about the daily lives of the ordinary people who lived in the shadow of the great stone walls, as opposed to the elite structures at the hill complex and great enclosure. These residential areas reveal evidence of organized urban planning, distinct residential zones, and clear evidence of craft specialization, including areas dedicated to iron smelting, pottery production, and textile work, painting a picture of a genuinely complex urban society with economic specialization, not merely a collection of huts surrounding an impressive but isolated royal monument. There's also ongoing work reassessing the full extent of the site's water management systems, evidence suggesting the inhabitants engineered features to manage rainwater runoff and support agriculture and daily water needs for a population in the tens of thousands. A genuinely impressive engineering challenge for a sub-Saharan African city predating European contact by centuries. All of this ongoing research reinforces the same fundamental point we've been building toward this entire video. Great Zimbabwe wasn't a mysterious anomaly, a fluke, or a monument built by some vanished foreign hand. It was the product of a sophisticated, organized, economically complex African society, one with specialized labor, urban planning, long-distance trade connections, religious and political institutions, and engineering knowledge refined over generations. The only real mystery left, at this point, isn't about the stones at all. It's about us, about why it took so long and so much deliberate resistance for that simple, evidence-backed truth to be widely accepted. Here's where this investigation widens out, because once you understand what happened at Great Zimbabwe, you start noticing the exact same pattern repeating itself, almost word for word, at other archaeological sites around the world. Anywhere a non-European civilization built something that contradicted 19th and early 20th century assumptions about who was capable of complex achievement. It's a documented pattern historians now sometimes refer to as diffusionism, the reflexive assumption that any sufficiently impressive ancient structure must have originated from or been influenced by a small number of advanced source civilizations, usually assumed to be European, Middle Eastern, or in some fringe theories, extraterrestrial, anything except the indigenous population living on or near the site. Consider the Cahokia Mounds in present-day Illinois, the remains of the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, home to an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people at its peak around 1100 CE, featuring massive earthen mounds, including Monk's Mound, which covers more ground area at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. For decades, 19th-century American archaeologists and popular writers promoted what became known as the mound builder myth, the theory that these earthworks must have been constructed by a vanished race of mound builders, often speculated to be Vikings, a lost tribe of Israel, or refugees from Atlantis, anyone except the ancestors of Native American peoples living in the region, whose own oral traditions and cultural continuity were simply ignored. Sound familiar? Or consider the Nazca Lines in Peru, enormous geoglyphs etched into the desert floor, so large they can only be fully appreciated from the air. Long before serious archaeological study clarified their likely ritual and astronomical purposes, popular pseudo-archaeological theories, most famously propagated by Erich von Daniken in the 1960s, suggested the lines must have been created with help from ancient astronauts, because apparently the idea of ancient Peruvian civilizations developing sophisticated surveying and engineering techniques on their own was harder to accept than the idea of alien visitors Or look at the ancestral Puebloan structures at Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest, multi-story stone great houses with sophisticated astronomical alignments, some of the most architecturally advanced pre-industrial structures in North America, which were, for a period, similarly subject to outside influence theories rather than being immediately credited to the clear architectural and cultural continuity connecting them to modern Puebloan peoples. Every single one of these examples follows an identical structural pattern to what happened at Great Zimbabwe. An indigenous or non-European society builds something genuinely impressive. European or Euro-American observers encounter it, and rather than immediately crediting the people who obviously built it, often the very people living in or near the ruins, sometimes with intact oral traditions, describing exactly who their ancestors were, those observers reach instead for an external explanation, because the alternative conflicts too sharply with their existing assumptions about which peoples are capable of civilization. What makes Great Zimbabwe such a uniquely powerful case study, though, isn't just that this pattern occurred. It's the sheer duration and the explicit political motivation behind its persistence. Unlike the Cahokia mound builder myth, which faded relatively naturally as American archaeology professionalized through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Great Zimbabwe myth was actively, deliberately, and officially maintained by a colonial government for political survival, right up until the year that government itself ceased to exist. That's not casual, old-fashioned scientific error. That's a myth weaponized and maintained as state policy. And once you see that distinction clearly, it reframes the entire story of Great Zimbabwe from an interesting historical misunderstanding into something much heavier. Direct evidence of how political power can override, suppress, and delay scientific truth for generations, not because the evidence was weak, but because the truth was inconvenient. It's worth pausing here to talk about something that rarely gets discussed in documentaries about Great Zimbabwe: the actual human cost of maintaining this myth for over a century. This wasn't just an abstract academic dispute confined to museum placards and scholarly journals. The deliberate misattribution of Great Zimbabwe was actively used as propaganda to justify the political and economic subjugation of the very people whose ancestors built the site. If African peoples were, as colonial ideology insisted, incapable of complex civilization, then colonization could be framed, however dishonestly, as a civilizing mission rather than what it actually was: resource extraction and political domination enforced through violence and legal discrimination. Rhodesian textbooks used in schools well into the mid-20th century taught children, including Black Zimbabwean children learning about their own ancestral heritage, that Great Zimbabwe was likely built by Phoenicians or some other foreign group, actively denying an entire population accurate knowledge of their own ancestors' achievements. Imagine walking past those very walls, built by your direct ancestors, and being taught in school that people who looked like you couldn't possibly have built them. That's not a minor historical footnote. That's a form of psychological colonization, erasing not just historical fact, but a population's connection to and pride in its own heritage, replacing it with an imported, false narrative specifically engineered to reinforce feelings of inferiority and justify continued political subjugation. This is precisely why the renaming of the country to Zimbabwe upon independence in 1980 and the deliberate placement of the Great Zimbabwe bird at the center of the new national flag carried such enormous symbolic weight. It wasn't simply choosing a nice historical landmark as a national symbol. It was a direct, public, permanent rejection of a century of deliberate historical erasure, a statement that said, unambiguously, this was ours, it was always ours, and no colonial government's insistence otherwise changes that fact. Understanding this emotional and political dimension is essential to really grasping why the Great Zimbabwe story matters so much today, not just to historians and archaeologists, but to millions of Zimbabweans and people across the African diaspora, for whom this site represents something far more personal than an interesting ancient ruin. It represents vindication. It represents the restoration of a truth that was deliberately, systematically denied to their grandparents and great-grandparents. If you visit Great Zimbabwe today, you'll walk through the great enclosure's narrow stone passageway, deliberately curved, some researchers believe, to control and slow movement for ceremonial or security purposes, and emerge into the open interior, where the conical tower still stands exactly as it has for roughly 6 centuries, its purely symbolic purpose still debated, its physical presence still commanding. You'll climb the hill complex, following the same granite pathways that royal figures and religious leaders once walked, past the platforms where the soapstone birds once perched, most of them now preserved in a small on-site museum, safely returned after their long, uncomfortable journey through colonial collections and private ownership. You look out across the valley complex, where thousands of ordinary people once lived their entire lives in the shadow of these walls, farming, trading, raising families, participating in a functioning urban society that thrived here for roughly 3 centuries, entirely independent of European contact or influence. And if you know the full story, the story we've walked through in this video, you'll understand that you're not just looking at impressive ancient stonework, you're looking at the site of one of history's most stubborn and revealing lies, and its eventual, hard-won correction. Karl Mauck stood at these same walls in 1871 and saw something he refused to believe. Cecil Rhodes funded excavations specifically designed to manufacture a false origin story. Gertrude Catton Thompson stood here in 1929, did the actual scientific work, told the truth, and was mocked for it. And for the better part of a century after that, an entire government continued enforcing a lie that had already been thoroughly, scientifically disproven, because the truth threatened the entire foundation of their claim to rule. That's the real story of Great Zimbabwe. Not just an engineering marvel, though it absolutely is one. Not just a mystery about mortarless stone construction, though we've now fully answered that mystery, down to the specific thermal quarrying technique used to shape the granite. It's a case study in exactly how historical truth gets suppressed when it's politically inconvenient, and exactly how long that suppression can last when the people telling the lie also control the schools, the museums, and the government. And it's a reminder that the work of historical correction, the work people like Randall McIver and Catton Thompson began, and that modern Zimbabwean archaeologists and historians continue today, isn't finished the moment good evidence exists. It's only finished when that evidence is finally, fully, publicly acknowledged and taught. For Great Zimbabwe, that process took over 100 years, which raises an uncomfortable final question worth sitting with as we close. How many other sites, across how many other continents, are still waiting for that same correction? If this investigation left you unsettled, if the idea that a scientifically disproven myth could be enforced as official government policy for over a century, purely to protect a colonial power structure, makes you want to know where else this exact pattern has played out, you're about to want to watch the next video in this series. Because there's another civilization, sitting at the edge of the Sahara Desert, whose story follows an almost identical arc to what we just uncovered, except the scale of wealth involved is almost impossible to comprehend. I'm talking about an empire so staggeringly rich in gold that its ruler, on a single religious pilgrimage across North Africa and the Middle East, gave away so much gold that he single-handedly crashed its market value across the entire Mediterranean world for the next decade. That's the Mali Empire and the legendary city of Timbuktu, home not just to gold and trade, but to one of the largest collections of scholarly manuscripts in pre-modern history, housed in a university that was actively teaching astronomy, law, and medicine centuries before many European institutions existed in their modern form. And just like Great Zimbabwe, the true story of Mali and Timbuktu was buried, downplayed, and actively misrepresented for generations, for reasons that will feel uncomfortably familiar by the time you finish watching. I've made a full deep dive covering that entire story, the wealth, the scholarship, the deliberate erasure, and the modern effort to preserve and reclaim it before it's lost forever. It's linked directly on screen right now and in the description below. If today's video made you angry, that one is going to hit even harder. And if you want to go even deeper into everything we covered today, full breakdowns of every imported artifact discovered at Great Zimbabwe, detailed satellite mapping of the entire site's layout, extended interviews and translated excerpts from Shona oral tradition, and a complete visual reconstruction of what the city likely looked like at its peak, I've put together a full companion feature covering all of that in additional depth. That link is also below and pinned in the comments. Thank you for watching this deep dive to the very end. If you learned something today, especially something that challenged what you thought you knew about African history, do me a favor and share this video with one person who needs to hear this story. These corrections don't happen automatically. They happen because people keep telling the truth loudly until it can't be ignored anymore. I'll see you in the next one.